It is springtime. All the snow is thankfully melted, so I'm going to take you guys through what I do to my bikes to get them ready for the riding season. So here I've got my 2005 CR125. She's looking pretty clean, but like any bike, it's going to need some work to get it ready for some riding. The first thing I'm going to cover is checking over the fluids and making sure everything is lubed up. On this bike we've got coolant, engine oil, brake fluid, and of course fuel. For coolant, it's as simple as just popping off the radiator cap and looking inside. Looks like it's pretty well topped off. If you guys are curious, this is the coolant that I use, Engine Ice, really good stuff. If you're unsure of when your coolant was last changed, or you haven't swapped it out for the past year or so, I would recommend changing it out for something like Engine Ice. Now for oil, with this bike being a 2-stroke, it's only got gear oil. So there's a fill plug up here, no dipstick, and then a check plug for checking the oil level. Since this bike does not have a dipstick, you'll be able to check the oil level by pulling out the check bolt. Once you pull the bolt out, a little bit of oil should come out, provided the bike is sitting level, preferably on a stand. And for oil, I use Shell Rotelli 1540, and I change it out at 10 hours of ride time, so about every 4 to 5 rides. Alright, that's it for the oil situation. Now I'm going to check the brake fluid. And it's as simple as just looking at the sight windows on the brake master cylinders. I'm actually going to take it a step further and bleed these brakes a little, since it has been a while and I've got a new little bleeding tool. Motion Pro sent over this mini bleeder tool for me to try out. Never used one before, so this should be fun. So how this bleeder tool works is it slides onto the bleeder valve on the caliper. Looks like I'll have to pull off the guard to access it, but it slides on and it's got a check valve inside of here. So that way you can leave the bleeder valve loose on the caliper and focus on pumping the brakes and keeping up on the fluid level. Let's give it a shot. Now with the bleeder tool on the caliper, I'm going to crack this valve loose. So this wrench actually moves around so you can get it in the right position. Just going to crack this thing loose and start bleeding the brakes. So I'm just going to go about a 1/4 turn loose right there. And I'm actually going to put the end of the hose on this tool into the cap of a water bottle. So that should contain the fluid right there. Ah shoot, I got my glove stuck in there. And the master cylinder cap will need to come off so that way I can add fluid. Now with the bleeder tool on the caliper, I can just pump the brakes and not have to worry about opening and closing the bleeder valve on the caliper. But of course, I'll need to watch the fluid level in the master cylinder. I'm just going to top off the master cylinder with fluid before I start bleeding the brakes. So this is the brake fluid that I've got around the shop right now, just regular Honda .4 brake fluid. And you want to make sure you use the correct spec brake fluid. If your cap says .4, use .4. So how this works is when I have the valve open and I push down the brake pedal, it'll push fluid and air out of the system, but the one-way valve won't let air back in. So I'm going to push down the pedal right now. You can see it pushed out some fluid and it didn't let any air back in. Once I pump the brakes a few times and close that valve back up, the brakes should have some great pressure. Takes a few pumps to build the pressure back up, but now the pedal feels great. Man, that tool is super nice to have. Works a lot better than I would have guessed. Takes all the hassle out of bleeding brakes. So I'm going to run the master cylinder down 3 times and that should get the majority of the old fluid out of the system. So I'm only going down till there's about half the fluid in the sight window here. Don't really want to go any further down than that. Alright, that should be good for bleeding. Just going to close up this valve and pull it off the caliper. Just going to pop this master cylinder cap back on and I'll be all finished up. And then the process for bleeding the front brakes is going to be very similar. Now for gas, I mix it 32:1 and I use Maxima Caster 927. I'm gonna mix up some fresh fuel for this thing. I'm gonna see if the old 125 still runs. Bike seems to be running prime, so I'm gonna take her out riding this upcoming Saturday. If you guys are in Washington State, more specifically the Spokane area, join me over at the 7 Mile ORV Park. I'll be out there this upcoming Saturday, April 14th. And then the day after that, April 15th, I'll have these new Prime MX shirts available over on my website, primemx.com. So mark your calendars for that too. All right, now it's on to making sure what needs to be lubed up is lubed up. And that includes the cables, clutch lever, throttle, the chain, and some of the bearings. I'm gonna start with the easiest thing first, lubing up the chain. This is the chain lube that I prefer, Chain Guard by Maxima. And I'll be spraying it in here on the inside of the chain near the chain guide. Now to have a buttery smooth clutch lever, most importantly, you gotta have it greased up here in the pivot. And having a nice lever definitely helps too. The Works connection one that I'm using here is a must have. So I'll be completely pulling apart this clutch lever and lubing up the cable at the same time. This perch and lever were definitely in need of a cleanup and regreasing. It's been a while since I've freshened them up. Another thing that can be taken apart and cleaned up is the cable adjuster. Having a smooth adjuster is a big plus. As for greasing, lately I've been using this mini grease gun a ton. Super handy to have, and it puts the grease exactly where you want it. Got the lever and the cable adjuster working super smooth. Now it's on to lubing up the cable. And once again, Motion Pro hooked it up. They sent over their cable lubing tool along with the cable lube. Now I've never used this design before, it should be interesting. So here I've got the tool out of the package. Looks like a pretty sweet setup. Just gonna thread the two pieces away from each other. Looks like there's a seal inside of it. So one collar slips over. And then the seal goes on with the larger taper facing the end of the cable. So something like that. Now I'm going to thread the other half of the tool onto the cable until the seals are firmly seated. just got to make sure the plunger is all the way extended before I squirt in any lube. The next step is to take the straw from the cable lube and insert it into the tool all the way. And now it's as simple as just spraying the lube into the tool. This is crazy. There's not cable lube spraying all over the place like with the other cable lubing tools I've used in the past. All right, I should have enough lube in the cable now. I'm gonna pull out the straw, and to get as much lube out of the housing as possible, I'm gonna depress the plunger here. Now the real test is to check out the other end of the cable and see if it's soaked from the lube. Oh yeah, she's wet. Can't wait to get this thing back together and see how smooth the lever is now. For the clutch cable slack, this is super important and it's something I'm really picky about. So I like to go until there's about the width of a quarter here between the perch and the lever. So I'm just tugging on the cable a little bit with some tension and simultaneously pulling in the lever, and you'll be able to feel the amount of slack the cable has there. So right about there is right where I like it. And generally this is where most people like it as well. And you definitely don't want to have no slack at all. That'll burn your clutch up right away. And too much slack, your clutch won't engage very well. That is unbelievably smooth now. Really impressed with the job that this little cable lubing tool did. Most definitely the best cable lubing tool I've used to date. Now for the throttle, I'm gonna take it apart, wipe it down, and grease it up. But this definitely is not as important as the clutch lever. If you have a sticky throttle, most likely it's the cable or the throttle tube hitting on the end of the handlebar. Was definitely worth pulling this one apart to clean up. So it's just a matter of wiping things down and greasing it back up. All right, I've got the throttle housing together, cables on the tube, and just gonna make sure everything's working smoothly here. So I'm gonna slide the throttle onto the handlebars all the way and then back it out just a little bit, maybe like a 1/4 inch or so. If you have the throttle all the way onto the handlebars where the tube is hitting the end of the bars, you'll have a sticky throttle. And then if you back it out a little bit, that's right where you want it. Just getting everything tightened up here, and then check the throttle one last time. Sweet, nice and smooth. Now it is possible to use the cable lubing tool on the throttle cable, but you'll need to go from the carburetor or throttle body end, whatever you have. If you lube from the top here, it'll dump a bunch of cable lube into your carburetor or throttle body. Now I'm gonna take a peek at some of the bearings on the bike, make sure they're in good shape. For the wheel bearings, I'm gonna move the wheel laterally to see if there's any movement in them. Looks like it's good to go. And now to check the shock linkage bearings, pull upward on the swing arm and you'll be able to see if there's any movement in them. If you pull up on the swing arm and there's some slop there, chances are it's the lower shock bearing, but it could also be these other 3 bearings as well, or the top shock bearing too. Now the swing arm pivot bearings don't wear out that often, but if you have a worn set, you'll feel some sloppiness there or some stiffness when you compress the rear of the bike. What I'll look for with the steering stem bearings is any notchiness or just a rough feeling when I'm turning the front end. This one feels pretty good. Now this isn't a bearing, but it needs to be greased as well, the Kickstarter pivot. So when kicked over, the Kickstarter should just go right back into place. If you have a sticky Kickstarter, you can pull apart the pivot, clean it up, and re-grease it. I do have a video on that on the channel, so head over there and check it out. One thing I'll check out before every single ride is the tire pressure, of course. I go 14 PSI up front and 12 in the rear. As you guys know, keeping up on your spokes is super critical as well. So my spoke maintenance consists of checking the spokes every 3 to 4 rides, I would say. So I just go through and tighten the spokes evenly. And my process for this is I'll start at either the rim lock or the valve stem. Tighten the first spoke, skip 2, tighten the third, skip 2, tighten all the way around until I come back to that starting point and then move to a second spoke. Follow the same pattern all the way around and then hit the third spoke all the way around again. And at that point, every spoke will have been tightened evenly. And I only usually go about an 1/8 or a 1/4 turn on each spoke, depending on how tight it already is. Periodically, I'll go through and do a general check over of all the bolts on the bike. The ones that are most frequent to come loose are the Kickstarter bolt, the sprocket and rotor bolts, and all of the plastic hardware. So those are the ones you really need to keep an eye on. I know this video is getting super long, but there's just a few more things I want to cover. So for the suspension seals, I'll compress the forks or the shock and look for fluid on the tubes. So if you have a leaky seal, it'll be pretty evident. Next up is the brake pads and rotors. For the pads, you just want to make sure there's sufficient material left over. Looks like these ones are getting down there, but still some life left. On the rotor, I'll run my finger from the mounting surface to the braking surface. And if there's a lip there, that means the rotor has some wear. Most rotors have a minimum thickness stamped on it. This one is 3.5 mil. So you can just go ahead and measure the rotor and see if it meets the spec. Also a great idea to check over your sprockets. You want to look for bent or hooked out teeth. And the last thing, you want to make sure you have a clean and oiled air filter. As you can see, I'm running a filter skin. Big fan of them, they work really well. To make it easy on you guys, I'll link all the tools and supplies I use throughout the video down below. If you would like to see more videos like this, hit the subscribe button down below. And next to it, there's a little bell. Click that and you'll be notified every time I post a new video. Thanks for watching.